This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and CuriosityStream. They are a documentary streaming service with loads of content on all kinds of subjects, from science to history and society. I use them sometimes to brush up on stuff before writing a script, which was no different with this episode. Since Judas and the Black Messiah focuses so much on Black Panther ideology, I watched a documentary on their most important influence. They had a strange swirl of Black power and Marxist ideology, and no one was more essential to that than Malcolm X. He had a rather antagonistic relationship with Martin Luther King, taking up very different positions on how to achieve a better future for Black people.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless.
Malcolm strove for liberation and independence, whereas King sought civil rights and equality. CuriosityStream has an excellent documentary showing how those ideologies both clashed and built from one another. Their antagonism was ultimately symbiotic, and there is so much more on their platform. If you go to the link below, which is curiositystream.com/cynicalhistorian, and enter the code cynicalhistorian, you'll get an entire year on their streaming service for just $14.99. With so much to choose from, you'll have more documentaries than you have time to watch. So anyways, on with the show. Hey, Cypher here. Judas and the Black Messiah is a surprisingly good film. It has some troubling inaccuracies, but the movie displays the nuances of this topic in a way that helps us understand it better despite the problems. The Black Panther Party is not an easy topic to cover. The historiography is fairly new, because what came before is riddled with disinformation. But it's worth understanding the history of the Panthers. Also, I want to thank Lynn Burnett for proofreading this script, since it is such a difficult one to cover. He runs a public history project called Cross-Cultural Solidarity, which is dedicated to making scholarly and primary sources publicly available on racial justice history. Please check out his website, linked in the description. Anyways, here's a brief history of the Black Panthers. After the Civil Rights Movement had accomplished its greatest achievement with the passage of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act a year later, the movement lost much of its political solemnity. The virtual leader of the movement was Martin Luther King, and he sacrificed public approval when he denounced the Vietnam War. Making matters worse was the lack of significant progress in material conditions for Black people. As the US deindustrialized, the premium jobs from the 1950s golden age of capitalism evaporated, which Black people felt the economic crunch more than white people. King turned his attention to economic equality and met fierce resistance from his once staunch allies in the white North and West.
If we can spend $35 billion a year to fight an ill-considered war in Vietnam, our nation can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet.
People's belief in nonviolence fell precipitously. Malcolm X had long criticized King's civil disobedience for disempowering Black people, instead encouraging Black empowerment and resistance to white supremacy, often including calls for violent retaliation. Only a couple weeks before the Selma protests, Malcolm's former organization, a Black nationalist group called the Nation of Islam, assassinated him. This did not silence his ideas, for only a year later, 2 California college students would take up his mantle. California had a very contentious gubernatorial election that year. Due to white-only covenants, Black people were ghettoized in urban centers, not only in California but throughout the nation. Governor Pat Brown had outlawed discriminatory housing in 1963. A ballot measure called Prop 14 tried to overthrow that, but the California Supreme Court overruled it. So Ronald Wilson Reagan ran on behalf of overthrowing the Rumford Fair Housing Act, after having supported Barry Goldwater's run a couple years prior, especially his opposition to the Civil Rights Act. Even former Republican governor and then Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren denounced Reagan's racial politics, but he won the 1966 election anyways. Fears of a white backlash to the Civil Rights Movement were high. That same year, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed a political organization called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They wrote a 10-point platform that would drive the party's goals for the next decade. Their listed virtues were land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. Some of these included such radical notions as calling the state an occupying force, segregating juries, releasing all black prisoners, and a racial exemption from military service. They required members to act as Marxist-Leninist vanguards of a coming revolution, though, like with many such radicals, not with much clear statements of what that revolution would entail. But of immediate concern was point 7, which called for an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people, other people of color, and all oppressed people inside the United States. That self-defense part of their name was of primary importance. Panthers organized as militants, purposefully evoking revolutionary movements from Africa by dressing in black leather and black berets while carrying shotguns. As early as October of 1966, they began counter-patrolling cops in Oakland. They'd arrive wherever police roamed around the Bay Area with their own armament. This led to a number of confrontations, which either side claimed the other was the aggressors. Nevertheless, open carry was perfectly legal in California, so the legislature decided to put an end to that. The Mulford Act outlawed open carry in the state. Before it could be passed in May of 1967, the Panthers made their most provocative showing yet in order to protest its passage.
The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense calls upon the American people in general and the black people in particular to take full note of the racist California legislature, which is now considering legislation aimed at keeping the black people disarmed and powerless at the very same time that racist police agencies throughout the country are intensifying the terror, brutality, murder, and repression of black people. At the same time that the American government is waging a racist war of genocide in Vietnam, the concentration camps in which Japanese Americans were interned during World War II are being re-innovated and expanded. Since America has historically reserved the most barbaric treatment for non-white people, we are forced to conclude that these concentration camps are being prepared for black people who are determined to gain their freedom by any means necessary.
They went into the Capitol in Sacramento, well armed, and actually made it into the Assembly's chamber before being forced to leave. Again, this was legal.
California Penal Code Section 12020 through 12027, and also the Second Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the citizen a right to bear arms on public property.
But it scared people. Newspapers even called it an invasion. Soon, the act was on Governor Reagan's desk.
Well, I think it's a ridiculous way to try and solve the problems that have to be solved among people of goodwill, and there's certainly nothing that can be done in the line of goodwill when Americans have guns with even the implied idea that those guns might be directed against other Americans. But I would think that some of the bills that have been suggested, such as not carrying a loaded weapon on a city street or in town, this might certainly be a good one. There is absolutely no reason why out on the street today civilians should be carrying a loaded weapon.
Counter-patrols were now illegal, but Panthers remained armed in private, and white Californians remained scared. While the Black Panther Party maintained its revolutionary rhetoric and use of intimidating imagery, they began a series of community outreach programs such as free breakfasts for kids and clinics that specialized in ailments that disproportionately afflicted black communities, though all of that would not start until 1969. These programs were a response to the Mulford Act and were meant to spread Panther ideology with outreach, which worked quite well. They quickly gained community support in Oakland, and Panther chapters spread throughout the US. With their open Marxism, they eventually forged ties with Cuba, North Korea, China, North Vietnam, and even had an international headquarters in Algeria because they supported a Pan-African liberation movement. This gave the FBI what they wanted. So, in August of 1967, just a few months after the events in Sacramento, they opened up a counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, on what they called black extremists. They would use whatever means possible to disrupt black power and civil rights organizations, including disinformation to sow distrust between the organizations, planting evidence to get them arrested, and infiltrating them with informants. J. Edgar Hoover would later say, "The Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. This was the worst political repression the US perpetrated during the late 1960s and early 70s, and it would cause much violence to come. But the Panthers had more immediate concerns than COINTELPRO in 1967. A few months later, Huey Newton got in an altercation with police who decided to arrest him after a routine pullover, despite him being freshly off probation. Though it's disputed, witness testimony indicates that Newton tore one of the cops' guns from its holster and shot both of them before one of them managed to shoot him in the gut. One died, and Newton would be in and out of jail for years. The movement to free Huey galvanized support for Black Power just in time for another tragedy to bring ardent civil rights protesters to change their faith in nonviolence. An assassin killed Martin Luther King in April of 1968. A series of riots broke out across the country, and King's mode of organized protest died with him. The Panthers capitalized on this, even bringing many members of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, or SNCC, over to their side, though leaders like Stokely Carmichael had already been moving in that direction. During the Olympic Games in Mexico, a couple American winners held up their black-gloved fists atop the podium in a live broadcast for all to see, the symbol of Black Power. The Panther Party itself grew to around 5,000 official members across the US in 1969. Interestingly enough, the membership was majority female. Women took a prominent role in the party. While some chapters had issues with misogynists, the opposite was true for most. They were leaders within the organization, pushed for sexual equality outside of it, including equal pay for equal work, and the end of legal subjugation after marriage, such as how married women couldn't open bank accounts, and forged links with Black Power feminists like Angela Davis, a communist professor who was not a Panther. These links made the relatively tiny membership in the party into a far greater influence on American racial politics, and women primarily forged that. Chicago was the most successful of the locations that year. Their leader, Fred Hampton, had brought together what he called a rainbow coalition that unified various multiracial gangs and leftists in the city. It successfully ended much of the violence in that city, but it represented a radical and armed underclass. That was so fearful that Hoover ordered the FBI to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. A police raid killed Hampton and another Panther. This was essentially an assassination, given that the only possible shot fired from the Panthers was by a man who was shot at the entrance as he was dying. This was the most prominent of all the COINTELPRO influence in the Black Panther Party. The security chief of the Illinois chapter was an FBI plant who provided the plans for Hampton's apartment. There were 3 other informants in that chapter alone. That's how severely COINTELPRO affected the Panthers. It was riddled with snitches. Some simply provided information, where others went far further to undermine the organization. This turned Panther violence inward, especially after key leadership was virtually eliminated. Fred Hampton was assassinated, Bobby Seale helped organize the 1968 protest in Chicago, which led to a trial and him being held in prison for contempt of court, then later indicted for supposedly ordering the execution of a member in New Haven. Huey Newton was in and out of jail for murder. Their Minister of Information fled the country from attempted murder charges, and even Angela Davis had to go on the run because she supposedly helped some Panthers get firearms later used in a police shootout. On top of all that, a conflict was brewing between the eastern and western branches of the party. The Panthers' constant search for snitches led to several murders in their ranks. The organization couldn't keep discipline either. Despite rules specifically stating those on duty could not use drugs, it was commonplace, making the Panther Party an easier target with Nixon's new war on drugs. Leaders would impose harsh punishments for violations, such as beatings. Because of this violence, there was internal pressure to fight back against the police, hence why there were so many clashes. This was the core of the rupture forming. Some chapters wanted more militancy and less focus on the 1969 programs of free clinics and food for black people. A split off from the Black Panther Party formed alongside a black nationalist group called the Republic of New Africa. They called themselves the Black Liberation Army and were explicitly terrorists. Some saw it as a paramilitary arm of the Panthers, but it was technically a distinct organization, though there were certainly ties. They went on a series of bank robberies, bombings, hijackings, and assassinations. This was bad enough, but Huey Newton was falling into drug-induced mania. On top of all of this, 1970 saw the beginning of a precipitous decline in membership. The demise of the Panthers was not merely from COINTELPRO repression, for the worst of it had been a year prior, when the Panthers were at their most successful. Instead, as one historian says, as blacks won greater electoral representation, government employment, affirmative action opportunities, as well as elite college and university access, the Vietnam War and military draft wound down, and the United States normalized relations with revolutionary governments abroad, it became impossible for Panthers to continue advocating armed confrontation with the state and still maintain Allied support. The party, racked by external repression and internal fissures, quickly and disastrously unraveled. The brief couple years of Black Panther favor were over. In 1971, the rupture in leadership came out in the open. Newton said Oakland would completely focus on its outreach programs, while Cleaver wanted to push for more self-defense. The East stayed loyal to Cleaver and the West to Newton. Somebody killed a Panther in Harlem, and the New York chapter blamed Westerners, so they captured a Westerner named Sam Napier and tortured him to death. That year, COINTELPRO was exposed by a break-in, and the FBI had to curtail their political repression, but they had published enough disinformation about the Black Panther Party to sour their reputation. Since the US had been moving towards détente, the Panthers could not maintain international favor. In '72, Algerian police cut off the Panther embassy. Newton got in one too many fights, and possibly murder, so he fled the country, eventually landing in Cuba. They maintained some connections to communist dictatorships, but most of their international acclaim was gone. Bobby Seale tried to bring the organization back to legitimacy by running for mayor of Oakland, and he actually got 40% of the vote. But that was the last thrashing of a dying system. The Black Panther Party remained a small Oakland fixture for the next few years, helping register black people to vote and maintaining a much reduced outreach program. They kept dwindling in support until finally ending in 1982. The Panthers had a lasting impact, both for how their outreach programs could uplift a community and how Black Power radicalism can function, but they simultaneously were a movement of their time. This story took a long time to be told. With all the disinformation about the Panthers, most people have a violent image of the Black Panther Party. This narrative perpetuated itself well into the 1990s, with scholars saying things like, while their ideological rhetoric may have been commendable, the tactics of the Black Panther Party members were no less ignominious than the police whom they criticized. Under the banner of black nationalism and revolutionary intercommunalism, the party leadership eventually dissolved into a group of gangsters and thugs. The party's corruption and reliance on guerrilla tactics ultimately undermined any claims it might have had to widespread political legitimacy among African Americans.
Sorry I had a fight in the middle of your Black Panther Party.
As we've seen with their actual history, this is overemphasizing their worst characteristics. It took former Panthers telling the story themselves to allow scholars to reassess the common story about the party. There was a spackling of memoirs from the 70s onwards, but they surged in the 90s and early 2000s. This recolored so many events and cast doubt on numerous crimes supposedly committed by Panthers, while simultaneously emphasizing their radical ideology and COINTELPRO repression. The files for COINTELPRO have been available since the 1970s, but were digitized in the late 1990s. You can search the FBI's archive yourself in the links below. They like to compile any and all information possible on their targets, so it's actually a useful resource. Both of these led to a number of histories that reconsidered the Panthers' legacy. They fleshed out the depths that the 90s lost. While one cannot leave out their violence, we must be careful to avoid making them into caricatures. There are indeed many who will complain in the comments that I'm unwilling to perpetuate their regressive dogma, maybe even citing pop history books that keep up the myth. But that's why I isolated my research to recent peer-reviewed and academic press works only. People often take historical reappraisal to legitimize their conspiracism, some to the point of straight-up racism. There are current groups like the new Black Panther Party who are legitimately hateful organizations, but most of the original Panthers denounce such bigotry, and scholars may easily separate them. It's a difficult balance to maintain, and I think Judas and the Black Messiah managed to pull it off. It would be so easy to make this film into an apology for the Panthers, but not only do they portray poor discipline among the Black Panther Party ranks and their wrongdoings, but they actually portray COINTELPRO in about as sympathetic a light as could be, and that's pretty difficult. Like, there was a point where I thought this movie was straight up anti-Black Panther, but it's more that they do a bit of time compression that I didn't recognize until I researched it. There are several shootouts, several caused by the Panthers themselves.
Now y'all get the fuck up out of here.
Interestingly enough, these are actually less than what happened in real life. They even talk about the regular anti-snitch violence, which is certainly not endearing.
What was all that shit about a badge?
Badge? Man, what the fuck is... Ow!
Boil some water. Gave him a little more discipline.
Where you at now?
He's at the bottom of the river with the rest of the trash.
The FBI handler in the movie, who was the real-life Roy Mitchell, uses this to draw a false equivalency between the Panthers and the Klan.
I understand. I'm not surprised. What did I tell you? No different from the Klan.
Which is definitely part of the COINTELPRO propaganda we still hear today. To really undo some of that disinformation, they very accurately portray Chairman Fred's assassination. Each of these depictions have their issues, which we'll get to, but generally speaking, this is some amazing moral ambiguity they managed to pull off. But the film obviously does sympathize with the Panthers more than their opponents. We really dive into their radical ideology.
Political power flows from the barrel of a gun. We in the Black Panther Party don't believe in no culture except revolutionary culture. What we mean by that is a culture that will free you.
And in order to overthrow this racist, fascist, nefarious U.S. government's gonna take everybody.
And it organically questions some of their extremism.
You were up on that stage using words, so maybe next time choose them a bit more carefully.
Kill a few pigs, get a little satisfaction. Kill them all, get complete satisfaction.
It even shows how the Panthers use their much-lauded free breakfast program to inculcate their ideology in children.
So our job as a Black Panther Party is to heighten the contradictions.
I pledge allegiance, to my black people.
You can see why the incredibly racist J. Edgar Hoover said,
"The Black Panthers are the single greatest threat to our national security, more than the Chinese, even more than the Russians. Our counterintelligence program must prevent the rise of a Black Messiah from among their midst."
That was actually in a memo, and the movie makes this seem like it happened a year prior to when it did, but that doesn't really matter. The movie gets a lot of small details correct. Just a few things that are offhandedly mentioned that are true are these.
That maybe your Uncle Sam might be able to help you provide.
Car. Yeah, Fred don't drive no more.
You know, I investigated the Schwerner Cheney Goodman murders down in Mississippi in '64.
Mr. Cleaver, on the lamb in Algeria, a gift from our friends at Langley. What will you do when she brings home a Negro?
Respectfully, Director, why are we talking about my daughter?
My mom used to babysit him, you know. Not all the time, but his family lived across the street, so every now and then she'd watch him.
So this movie is really well-rounded, but it does get a few things wrong. Most of the problems come from them just compressing time. Like they reference Richard Nixon as president before we get to 1969.
Tricky Dicky Nixon is the fattest, most filthy pig in the pen.
They also have Bill O'Neill steal a car by using a fake FBI badge, when it was him hijacking it and then using the badge to try to get out of arrest. But otherwise it's true that this made him become an informant. The time they meet with the Young Patriots while forming the Rainbow Coalition is depicted as the Panthers just randomly showing up, when in reality they were double booked for the same meeting place. And they combine a couple of shootouts into one here. Time compression is necessary, and these are really minor things. There are a few falsifications that are a bit worse though, all of which upset that ambiguity I praised this film for. To start off with, they make that guy who killed the snitch into someone who was working for the FBI.
Alex Rackley was labeled an informant and then killed by an actual FBI informant. And we're just letting him walk for murder?
That's patently false. Panthers did suspect him of that when he turned state witness against Bobby Seale, but we have the COINTELPRO documents on this, and they clearly show that he was merely a murderer trying to get a lesser sentence. It's also kind of funny that he killed somebody suspected for being a snitch and therefore was in turn suspected for being a snitch. This information has been publicly available since 1976, so this is obviously demonization for something that has plenty of real things that they did. No need to make up stuff. Then there's this part where they claim that the police killed a panther who was in the hospital.
Get this shit off of me. Hey, motherfucker.
They killed him.
That's the stand-in for Larry Robertson, who actually died of jaundice, relating to wounds sustained from the correctly shown gunfight. Then a panther goes on a revenge spree, but this was actually an ambush with 2 panthers, not just one, and it was not for revenge. Then they show Bill getting paid for his snitching by getting a small business paid for by the FBI.
For a gas station in Maywood, you own your own business now, Bill.
And that is just strange. The movie makes both Bill and Fred seem way older than they actually were. Fred was 21 when he died, and Bill was 17 at the time. So having some business was just not in the cards for the kid. It really changes your view of these guys when you realize how young they were. Like, the overtly violent rhetoric and acting all radical and whatnot really plays to some juvenile sensibilities. Sure, they were talking revolution, but the Black Panther Party itself was ultimately looking to elevate black people, using their militancy as a counterbalance to police brutality. That's kinda core to understanding the Panthers, and the movie just blows right past that. Finally, there is this end card. While O'Neill probably did have regrets for what he had done, he actually committed suicide hours before the first episode of that show aired, and the episode he appears in would not come out for another month. So that is an entirely misleading end card. But I think ultimately, that stuff doesn't hinder the narrative too much. Well, yes, there is some demonization, some hardcore demonization. Considering we're talking about COINTELPRO, it isn't exactly unwarranted. They could have done better, but this is a topic that is quite difficult to keep the balance. The Panthers were indeed violent, but their violence came from political repression. That doesn't excuse their misdeeds, for ends do not justify the means. A provocateur may only provoke those already willing to commit a crime, which means they are not absolved simply because of that provocation. Finally, hypocrisy doesn't mean they are incorrect. The Black Panther Party may have turned in on themselves, furnishing the perfect portrait for demonization, but their message was so resonant in 1969 that it overcame FBI repression for their brief time in the spotlight. In turn, COINTELPRO itself ultimately tarnished the reputation of the FBI, leading to immense oversight at least until 9/11. These conflicts leave us with much to contemplate, just as Judas in the Black Messiah does. And that is why I think this movie stands up well, despite its immense flaws.
It's time to take back. It's time for us to fight back. And we don't take your phony words anymore.
Often...
What's this? What's this? What's this? Go get it.